Hello there, everyone. If you're watching this video, then you are part of the TTOR army, an army that is building itself up one subscriber at a time. As you can see from the title and thumbnail of today's video today, we have a doozy of a topic. Now, as you can see right here on screen, back on October 18th, 2022, I put out a video titled, Paulogia claims sin doesn't exist in order to avoid being held accountable for his sins. And as you can see in the screenshot that I have it paused on, Paulogia put out in a tweet back in October of 2022 that sin doesn't exist if God doesn't exist and that we shouldn't fall for guilt tactics since this is the case. And so I responded to that tweet and also made a lot of observations about the atheist internet community in general that Paulogia is a part of, and talked about how they all are trying to avoid accountability for their sins ultimately. Well, Paulogia got wind of my video and he was so bothered by it, he was so triggered by it, that he actually decided to make his own response video to it on his Paulogia live channel. He stole the title of my video for his response video, calling it Paulogia claims sin doesn't exist in order to avoid being held accountable for his sins. And the video was uploaded to his Paulogia live channel on December 8th, 2022, and it has over 19,500 views. So in terms of traffic, his video is doing quite well relative to the size of his Paulogia live channel. But after watching Paulogia's video response to me in its entirety the first time around, I decided that there was only one appropriate response to Paulogia.
I am going to destroy him.
Sure. May I ask how?
Good question, Android 17. And if you want to know the answer to that question, stay tuned. Now, I will say right off the bat, before we get into this video, I am going to be responding to almost every second of footage in this video by Paulogia. There's a 1-minute clip near the beginning that I chose not to respond to, and then there's like the last, I think, 50 seconds to a minute of the video where I don't respond to it because most of it's just Paulogia playing my footage and then saying something that wasn't worth responding to because I think I already covered it. But we're going to be responding to so much of Paulogia's video that I don't think Paulogia or any of his fans will legitimately be able to say that I'm leaving anything out or taking things out of context in relation to Paulogia's video. It is in the first 29 seconds of this video where we see Paulogia say something that I feel is worth responding to.
Are we atheists? Are we non-believers just because we want to sin? And that is the topic of our final video of the night. TTOR, Justin Derby, is a gentleman who I knew from years ago, made a bunch of response videos when he was on YouTube to my Young Earth creation response videos. He didn't like me then. At one point, Shannon Q had a conversation with him. He's someone who left my life and my awareness circles a while ago. But when I was working...
So, as we could see in that clip, Paulogia talks about how I made response videos to his content years ago, that I was once interviewed by his girlfriend Shannon Q, which is true, and that I fell out of his awareness circle a long time ago. Well, let me explain to you, Paulogia, why I fell out of your awareness circle back then. The reason why I fell out of Paulogia's awareness circle is because back in 2018, I became so fed up with the increasing YouTube censorship regarding news and current events topics that I decided to leave YouTube and focus on building up my BitChute channel. Over the next 3 years, I went from having a tiny BitChute channel to being one of the top 5% creators on the site in terms of subscribers and total video views. Although the last time I confirmed that was back in 2021, So I don't know if I'm still in the top 5% on BitChute among creators or if I've slipped to the top 10%. I'm not quite sure which is true at this moment. However, I never stopped doing creationism topics, but I did start doing a lot of coverage of news and current events. And I also started uploading my content to other sites like Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, Joshu TV. I even started my own YouTube alternative called Quarter last year. The reason why I came back to YouTube 13 months ago and subsequently came back into Paulogia's radar, into his awareness circle, is because my friend Brett Keane encouraged me to come back to YouTube with him, and I decided to come back just for the hell of it. Just to see if my increase in production value on my content and my better speaking style than I had years ago, I just wanted to see if I could grow better on YouTube than I did back then. But it's not something I'm living for because I'm on a bunch of different sites. And just to prove the point to Paulogia that I'm not just on YouTube anymore, here is my Rumble channel, which is the biggest YouTube alternative in terms of web traffic and total users. Here's my Odyssey channel. Here's my BitChute channel, where as you can see I have over 2,300 subs and I have over 580,000 total video views. And if you look at my most viewed videos on my BitChute channel, there are videos that have several thousand views on them. And I've lost count of how many videos on BitChute of mine have over 1,000 views. So on BitChute, I'm actually a really popular guy. Here's my YouTube channel, which is run by the Utah Gun Exchange, a pro-Second Amendment organization in the United States of America. I have 160 subs there, and I have, if you go scrolling through my library, a lot of videos with hundreds, even 1,000 plus views on that site. And then here's my Joshu TV channel, which is run by my friend Josh, Seeking the Truth. And with my 107 subscribers, I'm actually one of the biggest channels on his small website, which is a small website in terms of users and web traffic, not a small website in terms of features and functionality. And then, as I mentioned before, here is Quarter, which is my very own YouTube alternative that I started last year. It's very similar to Joshu TV because it uses the exact same video sharing site script, an open source script called A-Video, and I have pretty much all the same features and functionality that Joshu TV has. Plus, I turned on a couple that Joshu TV doesn't, but that's neither here nor there. So, between running my own YouTube alternative called Quarter, and between having all of my content up on all these different video sharing sites, as well as YouTube, well, you're not just dealing with a simple Christian YouTuber anymore, Paulogia. You're dealing with a video content creator who has his eyeball in the future and has taken every step possible to prevent himself from being censored. So even in the worst case scenario where I get banned from YouTube and Rumble and Odyssey and BitChute and YouTube and, God forbid, Joshu TV, I still have my own YouTube alternative that I run that I will be able to put my content on. You can't silence me anymore. And I don't mean you, Paulogia. I mean the general censorious people out there who would love to silence people like me. Now, we're going to pick up right where we left off at the 29-second mark, and we're going to watch the next 33 seconds of footage. Let's get into it.
On the last Kent Hovind video, which if you saw was rather disturbing and awful, you may have saw TTOR in there. Justin talking, he did his own research about Kent Hovind, and to Justin's credit, he has determined that Kent Hovind's personal flaws, of which there are many, and I don't want to sully the stream going into, overcome any of the right ideas that he has about creation and all those kind of things. And Justin is one of the people calling out Kent Hovind supporters, and with me would say that there are better places to put your young earth creationist support and money and that kind of thing. Someone who does.
And as we could see in this clip, Paulogia gives me credit for my original Kent Hovind expose series regarding the Chris Jones situation, and he praises the work that I did in the series. So it looks like all of those years I spent getting my journalism degree finally paid off. And after all, if you follow that whole situation, the Daily Beast picked up on that whole story like a month or two ago, which we had beaten them to the punch by several months, almost a year. And if you look at that Daily Beast article, a lot of the information that was talked about in that story came from people like me and Brett Keane and Cindy Lincoln and Mark Stoney and others already covering it. So I am part of the cabal of people on the internet who exposed the whole Kent Hovind, Chris Jones situation long before the Daily Beast got in on the act. And I will agree with Paulogia on this. Paulogia and I both agree that there are better young earth creationists than Kent Hovind to support and invest in terms of your monetary donations or any kind of financial investment. And I'm not talking about myself, although I certainly would appreciate that. I mean, there's the Northwest Creation Network, there's the Apologetics Forum of Snohomish County, there's Sal, and there's a whole bunch of people I could have probably made a list of that would be better to support than Kent Hovind if you're a young earth creationist. But with that aside, also when I look at Paulogia praising my work and giving me credit for my Kent Hovind expose series, this praise that I get from Paulogia only cements my personal theory that the atheist internet community would be singing my praises right now and all of the time if I chose to identify as one of them and spent my time attacking Christians and creationists. Because you see, I'm actually a very smart guy, and I do very good work in my content, and the atheist internet community would appreciate that a lot more if I wasn't applying my skills to them. So, yeah, if I was an atheist attacking Christians and creationists, Paulogia would not be the only one praising my work and the quality of my content. Pretty much all of his atheist internet friends would be doing the same thing. Now we're going to play the next 24 seconds of this video where Paulogia once again says something that is worth responding to.
Less harm. Anyway, so Justin got back on my radar, and I noticed as I was doing that video that he put out this video. Paulogia claims sin doesn't exist in order to avoid being held accountable for his sins. That's a long title, but it has my name in it. So it's not just a generic, you just want to sin. Apparently, Paulogia just wants to sin. So let's see what Justin has to say.
So, as we could see from that 24-second clip of the video, Paulogia says that he came across my video. Paulogia claims sin doesn't exist in order to avoid being held accountable for his sins. And he assumes that I'm only going to be talking about him instead of the general atheist internet community. And I am sorry, Paulogia, that you got the impression that you did off of the title of my video, but it seems to me that you don't understand how the way I titled my video is actually a common practice for content creators. There are many content creators who will put together a video or a live stream where they talk about many different things or topics, but they will title the video based on one specific topic or clip of their video or live stream. And in my case, I used Paulogia's tweet as a prompt to discuss why the general atheist internet community denies the existence of God. There is no written or unwritten rule that prevents me from doing this. The fact that I even have to explain this to you, Paulogia, frankly, is pretty embarrassing. It's an embarrassment. You should already know this after all the years that you've been on the internet as a content creator. I shouldn't have to be explaining this to you at all. But as we will see later in the video, even though I mostly spoke about the general internet atheist community instead of Paulogia specifically in the video he's responding to, you'll see later in the video that Paulogia too actually does attempt to avoid accountability for his sin in a variety of ways, but we have yet to get to that. That comes later. Let's get instead to the next clip, which will take up about 53 seconds. We need to talk about a recent tweet that Paulogia put out. A tweet that actually...
We need to talk about Paulogia's tweet, guys. Twitter, man. If anything is going to get me canceled in this world, it's my activity on Twitter. I like Twitter too much. It's fun, and I like to have fun there.
Shows that everything he has to say about atheism and evolution and a lack of evidence for God's existence and the truthfulness of the biblical worldview. A recent tweet that Paulogia put out proves that all of that is just an intellectual smokescreen.
All of it. Holy cow, guys. What have I done? I put out a tweet. In one tweet, I have undermined everything I've ever said about the Bible, everything I've said about Christianity, everything I've said about science has been undermined in a single tweet. I'm going to be canceled, guys. Holy cow. Hopefully I can get back and erase this. Maybe we can delete it. What did I tweet?
So, as we could see in that clip, Paulogia responds to my point about his tweet proving that all his anti-creationism stuff is an intellectual smokescreen by sarcastically claiming that he's going to get canceled over it. The irony of Paulogia's comment is pretty rich because later on in this video, we're going to see that Paulogia himself has engaged in cancel culture tactics years ago. But what I want to do for your attention right now is talk about what an intellectual smokescreen is. And in order to properly explain what an intellectual smokescreen is, let's go to the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of a smokescreen. Definition number 1 is a screen of smoke to hinder enemy observation of a military force, area, or activity. Definition number 2, which is the relevant definition to what we're talking about now. Something designed to obscure, confuse, or mislead. The second definition is the one that applies when I claim that Paulogia's anti-creationism, pro-evolution content is an intellectual smokescreen. The reason why Paulogia's anti-creationism, pro-evolution content is an intellectual smokescreen is because it obscures, confuses, and misleads people on what the heart of the issue really is for non-believers. The truth is that for atheists like Paulogia, accountability for sin is the real issue, but they know that denying the existence of God and sin in order to avoid accountability for sin is stupid. Even Paulogia himself later on in this video will acknowledge how stupid this idea is. Therefore, atheists like Paulogia set out to make you think that the reason they reject God's existence is because of the lack of scientific evidence supporting his existence or the truthfulness of the Bible. We all know, those of us who are familiar with Paulogia, we all know that Paulogia is an atheist content creator who does not believe that God exists, so when Paulogia puts out a tweet saying that sin doesn't exist if God doesn't exist, then we have no choice but to conclude that Paulogia's rejection of God is based on sin and avoiding accountability for it, no matter how much Paulogia says to the contrary. And one last thing I'd like to point out about intellectual smokescreens is that you can use things that you know or believe to be true in order to obscure, confuse, or mislead people away from something you really don't want them to look at. I have zero doubt that Paulogia believes all the stuff he says about evolution and science being true in regards to origins. The point I'm making is that by getting you to focus on science and evolution in order to deconvert you from belief in God, Paulogia is diverting your attention away from the morality and sin issue that is staring him in the face like the elephant in the room that it is. And now I know Paulogia makes fun of me later for ascribing really one-dimensional villain thinking to him, but I have no doubt not only that Paulogia believes what he says in regards to evolution and science, disproving the Bible and young earth creationism, but I also have no doubt that he really believes that God doesn't exist. I have no doubt that he's convinced himself, and he's had other people convince him, that God doesn't exist. And we're going to see later on in the video, Paulogia is going to display multiple behaviors that indicate that he is trying to avoid accountability for sin. But it is in the next 31 seconds of his video where we see Paulogia commit a logical fallacy. Paulogia actually has a much simpler reason for rejecting God. He doesn't want to be held accountable for his sins by God, and we can prove that here today using Paulogia's own words. Now,
Holy cow, guys. So I just want to sin. Everything that I do is because I want to sin. None of it's because I believe what I'm saying. And holy cow, we're going to prove it. Prove using only my own words. I'm in trouble. My own words.
So, as we could see in that particular clip, Paulogia falsely claims that I said that I was going to prove Paulogia was trying to avoid accountability for his sins using only Paulogia's own words. The problem with this claim of Paulogia's is that in the clip of me that he plays, you never heard me say that we were going to prove this using only Paulogia's own words. Paulogia inserted the word only in there to set up a straw man of me that he can tear down later in the video. Paulogia does go on later in the video to talk about what a good guy he is, so maybe Paulogia can explain why he thought it was okay to lie by putting words into my mouth that I never actually said, thus committing the Strawman Fallacy. Now, we're going to skip ahead to the 3:49 mark of this video, and we're going to see Paulogia talk until the 5-minute and 35-second mark of the video. And it's in this clip where we see Paulogia say the following. If I refuse to believe in atheistic evolution because it never has and can never be proven true by observational science, then I'm anti-science, LOLs.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. Let's go backwards. So LOLs, plural of laugh out loud. Maybe I'm too old. I don't know what LOLs with a Z for the Canadians. What that is, it's not plural, it's just put an A. Anyway, fine. You're an LOL person. I'm a laugh emoji person. To each their own, no problem. So if I refuse to believe in atheistic evolution because it never can be proven true by observational science. Now, I am a little bit concerned here for a second because Justin earlier said that he was going to prove stuff about me, and yet he doesn't seem to understand how scientific proof works. Nothing gets proven to be true in science. In science, things fail to be proven false. We prove things to be wrong, that's falsifiability, all the time. That's how we get better ideas, but nothing is ever proven true. No one's ever proven gravity to be true. No one's ever proven magnetic forces to be true. Again, these are theorems that we can prove to be false, but we still hold as tentative as the best explanation we have right now. So Justin, I'm a little bit worried that you don't understand what proof is, but also clearly you are anti-science, my friend, if you think that science proves things right. You don't get it. And I didn't either. I used to believe what you believed just a few short years ago. You and I would have been friends on all this, but I've learned more. So I'd encourage you to learn more. That is not how science works. And so you're fine to believe in creationism and in young earth creationism and all that kind of stuff, but at least embrace then the fact that you are anti-science, at least at this level.
So, as we could see in this clip, Paulogia claims that I am anti-science, and he claims that science is not about proving things to be true because I pointed out that evolution never has and never can be proven true by observational science. Now, when I made this claim about observational science, maybe that went over Paulogia's head, but he seems to be completely unaware that the idea that evolution is not based on observational science and can never be proven true by observational science is not my idea or the idea of any creationist individual or organization on planet Earth. The idea that evolution is not based on observational science and can never be proven true by observational science actually comes straight from Ernst Mayr, one of the most die-hard evolutionists in history. And to prove it, I'm going to go ahead right now and take you to this archived Scientific American article titled Darwin's Influence on Modern Thought, which you can see right here on the screen. It was written by Ernst Mayr, and when you scroll down a little bit into the article, you see a section called A Secular View of Life. And it is in the paragraph here, the second paragraph of that section, where Ernst Mayr said the following. These four insights served as the foundation for Darwin's founding of a new branch of the philosophy of science, a philosophy of biology. Despite the passing of a century before this new branch of philosophy fully developed, its eventual form is based on Darwinian concepts. For example, Darwin introduced historicity into science. Evolutionary biology, in contrast with physics and chemistry, is a historical science. The evolutionist attempts to explain events and processes that have already taken place. Laws and experiments are inappropriate techniques for the explication of such events and processes. Instead, one constructs a historical narrative consisting of a tentative reconstruction of a particular scenario, or the particular scenario, that led to the events one is trying to explain. So according to Ernst Mayr, one of the most diehard evolutionists to ever live, he says that evolution is a historical science and not an observational science. He even goes so far as to say it is inappropriate to try to use observational science to prove that evolution is true. And what's funny about him saying this is that when you see young earth creationist ministries like Answers in Genesis claim that there's a difference between observational science and historical science, I've seen so many atheists and evolutionists respond to AIG by claiming that they're lying, there's no such thing as a historical science versus an observational science, and that the folks at AIG and young earth creationists in general are just making this whole thing up. But when I went to Answers in Genesis's website to figure out where they got this idea that evolution is a historical science and not an observational science, and that there's a difference between observational science and historical science, AIG actually linked back to this article by Ernst Mayr to prove what they were saying was true. So this idea of there's a difference between observational and historical science, and that evolution falls into historical science and not observational science, this actually comes from an evolutionist, not a creationist. But because creationists started talking about it, the atheist evolutionist community proceeded to claim that creationists were just making this whole thing up, even though it was an evolutionist that laid all this out. And just in case you don't believe me that Ernst Mayr was a diehard evolutionist, I have here on screen an article on Edge called Ernst Mayr, What Evolution Is. And when you go to the actual article, the actual interview that Edge did with Ernst Mayr, Edge asked Ernst Mayr, to what extent has the study of evolutionary biology been the study of ideas about evolutionary biology? Is evolution the evolution of ideas, or is it a fact? And Ernst Mayr said in response, that's a very good question. Because of the historically entrenched resistance to the thought of evolution documented by modern-day creationism, evolutionists have been forced into defending evolution and trying to prove that it is a fact and not a theory. Certainly the explanation of evolution and the search for its underlying ideas has been somewhat neglected, and my new book, the title of which is What Evolution is precisely attempting to rectify that situation. It attempts to explain evolution. As I say in the first section of the book, I don't need to prove it again. Evolution is so clearly a fact that you need to be committed to something like a belief in the supernatural if you are at all in disagreement with evolution. It is a fact, and we don't need to prove it anymore. Nonetheless, we must explain why it happened and how it happens. So, according to Ernst Mayr, evolution allegedly is such an established fact of science that we don't need to try and prove its truthfulness anymore, in spite of the fact that Ernst Mayr himself claimed it is inappropriate to use observational science to prove evolution to be true. As for Paulogia's claim that science is not about proving things to be true, he is straight up lying to you all. Paulogia is straight up lying about science not being about proving things to be true. The whole point of the scientific method is about performing an experiment for the purpose of potentially verifying your hypothesis while being open to the possibility that the experiment could prove your hypothesis to be false. If science was not about attempting to prove a hypothesis to be true, then there would be no point in conducting any scientific experiments at all. By claiming that science is not about proving things to be true, Paulogia is proving that he is anti-science. He is the anti-science one in this equation. After all, if science wasn't about proving things to be true, then why have evolutionists wasted well over 100 years worth of history trying to find evidence of transitional fossils? Why did they set up experiments to try to prove that you could have life come from non-living material without an intelligent agent being involved in the mix? Why did they try doing any of this stuff if they weren't trying to prove their beliefs and their hypotheses to be true? Now, we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to play the next 57 seconds, and Paulogia is about to get really silly up in here.
Now, the last part about this to unpack, the original tweet that I responded to said, am I anti-science if I don't agree that my ancestor was an ape? Now, Justin's problem here is going to be that what he calls observable science can't prove evolution, but that wasn't the claim that I was talking about. I'm talking about whether our ancestors are apes, and here's the problem. Observable, testable science tells us that we are currently apes. There's no scientific definition of ape that we do not classify as. We are apes. And you can disagree then with how scientists classify things, that's fine. But then you are anti-science. We are apes. So my ancestors were also apes. My children are apes. My parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, we don't have to go back millions of years to come across our ape ancestors. Statistically, we still are. So any complaints you have about this, yeah, just completely put you in the realm of anti-science.
You serious?
So, as we saw in that clip, Paulogia claims that all humans living today, including me and him, are currently apes, and that I am anti-science if I disagree with that. Well, I don't get why Paulogia... Wait a minute.
Hold the phone.
Why didn't I see this before? Oh, of course! How could I be so foolish? You see, guys, I've made a colossal mistake here. I've been interpreting Paulogia through the lens of the biblical worldview in young earth creationism. So when I look at Paulogia through these lenses, I see a human being made in the image of God. But I have seen the error of my ways, and so when I take off the lens of the biblical worldview and young earth creationism, and I instead look at Paulogia through the reality that is biological evolution over billions of years, oh my goodness, Paulogia's right. He really is an ape. I can't believe I got this so wrong. In all seriousness, though, the fact that Paulogia would so adamantly insist that he, me, and every other human alive today is an ape is a dead giveaway that Paulogia is trying to avoid accountability for his sins. All you have to do to come to that conclusion is think through it logically. Apes are animals, and we don't hold animals accountable for their morality or behaviors in the same way that human beings hold each other accountable for our morals and actions. Therefore, if we are just apes instead of human beings made in the image of God, then we aren't and shouldn't be held responsible for our behaviors and actions in the way that we currently are. This explains why there is a big push in the Western world, especially in the USA, to normalize child grooming and pedophilia in the same manner that homosexuality was normalized. And just in case you don't believe me, Paulogia, here's my recent video. Atheist professor claims adults molesting 1-year-olds is not morally wrong. If you want to see just how sick and twisted your worldview can make people, Paulogia, be sure to bring a barf bag to this video. Now, it is in the next 1 minute and 14 seconds of this video where we see Paulogia say the following.
That's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about whether or not my whole channel and project here at Paulogia has been destroyed by a tweet and that I want to sin, but that's just a rant. Thank you for bearing with.
Amazing the stupid positions atheists will hold to in order to avoid being held accountable for their sins by God. Now, why did I throw in that last part? Well, before I responded to this tweet, Paulogia put out a tweet earlier.
I just back to one last thing there. So he's conflating that my belief in evolution is because I want to sin. I don't know what Justin does with the millions and millions of Christians around the world, if not hundreds of millions, who accept evolution, but yet are Christians. What is their motivation for accepting evolution? There can't be facts that make them accept it, because he would claim there's no facts to back it up. But it also can't be just because they want to escape God's wrath or avoid the idea of sin, because they do accept the idea of sin. So again, there's big holes with this whole thing. But carrying on, again, we're here to talk about me and how I just want to sin.
Here that day saying,
This is the tweet that brings down Paulogia.
so, as we saw in that particular clip, we saw Paulogia question how I handle the theistic evolutionists who are part of the old Earth creationism movement, and he questions what motivation theistic evolutionists could possibly have to accept evolution in billions of years if they aren't trying to avoid accountability for sin. Paulogia then claims that there are big holes in my logic. While there are no big holes in my logic, there are apparently giant holes in Paulogia's knowledge base. While it is true that theistic evolutionists are not motivated to accept evolution in billions of years by a desire to avoid accountability for sin, we know for a fact that theistic evolutionists accept evolution in billions of years because they view the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community as a higher authority than the Bible on origins. How do we know this for a fact? Well, you see, Paulogia, I read books. Back in 2015, there was a theistic evolutionist named Perry Marshall who put out a book titled Evolution 2.0. And in this book, Perry Marshall makes a bunch of arguments against young Earth creationism. But more interesting than his arguments against young Earth creationism, Perry Marshall claims the following on page 327 of his book, Evolution 2.0. Modern science speaks much more definitively about the age of the Earth than the Bible does, so it is perfectly legitimate to allow science to settle this question. In other words, as you could see from Perry Marshall's own words in his own book that he put out 8 years ago, the Bible is a lower authority than the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community on the topic of origins. Therefore, we should allow science and the academic community to answer the question of origins and the age of the earth and universe. That is a man that has a very low view of the Bible. Furthermore, back in 2013, William Lane Craig admitted that old Earth creationists reinterpret the Bible in light of the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community on the topic of origins, even though they know they're not supposed to. And as proof of this, let's go ahead to the video I put out over a year ago. I put out on April 6, 2022, titled William Lane Craig Lies About Bible Interpretation, Augustine, and Origin. We will start at the 5-minute mark of this video of mine, and we will run through the 9-minute mark so that you not only see William Lane Craig admitting these things, but you see my detailed translation of what he said. Let's let it rip.
Well, I think with regard to Christian faith and practice, I would say you need first and foremost to do your biblical hermeneutics responsibly and objectively. You need to not interpret the Bible in light of modern science, but to interpret it according to what its original author and original audience would have understood. That's the first and foremost task, is to interpret the Bible objectively and correctly. Then the second task will be trying to integrate what we learn from the Bible with the worldview of modern science, so as to have a sort of synoptic worldview that takes into account all that we've learned, not only from divine revelation, but from God's revelation in nature, in the book of nature. And then we will build a synoptic sort of worldview that makes the best sense of the data.
So as you can see in that clip you saw, back in a 2013 podcast that he was on, where he was talking about how young Earth creationism is embarrassing, and he was making all kinds of arguments against young Earth creationism, William Lane Craig took the time to address what proper Christian practice should be in regards to old versus young Earth creationism. And William Lane Craig said that step one is to interpret the Bible objectively and correctly. And what he means by that is you accept the straightforward reading of the Bible and you don't reinterpret it in light of anything else, including the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community. I agree with step one, but then William Lane Craig added a step 2 to what should be a one-step program. And he said that the next thing that Christians need to do as far as proper Christian practice goes is they need to take what they learn from the Bible and what they learn from the worldview of modern science. Not the data in science, the worldview of modern science, which is code speak for the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community. So you need to take what you learn from the Bible, and you need to take the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community, and you need to bring them together to create a synoptic worldview that makes sense of the data in both. In other words, what William Lane Craig was teaching back in 2013 is that Christians should reinterpret the Bible in light of the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community on origins, even though they're not supposed to. Now, someone might object and say, but William Lane Craig didn't say those exact words. Well, think about it. If you were to define what it means to reinterpret the Bible in light of modern science or in light of the worldview of modern science, how would you define that? You would define it in the exact way that William Lane Craig described. You would say, well, you take what you learn from the Bible, you take the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community, and you bring them together and create a synoptic worldview that makes sense of the data in both. In other words, you reinterpret the Bible in light of the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community, even though you're not supposed to. Not only was William Lane Craig admitting back in 2013 that this is exactly what he does to justify his older creationism beliefs, but he was also saying, as you could see from the clip, that this is a practice that all Christians should be doing. All Christians should be reinterpreting the Bible in light of the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community, even though they're not supposed to. In light of the fact that theistic evolutionists and older creationists view the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community as a higher authority than the Bible on origins, and in light of the fact that older creationists and theistic evolutionists reinterpret the Bible in light of evolution in billions of years, even though they know they are not supposed to, it's pretty safe to conclude that all theistic evolutionists are heretics and false teachers. And I have been teaching so on my channels for years. And I got way more dirt on theistic evolutionists and older creationists than what I've presented here in this video. Now, we're going to resume the video and we're going to run to the 8-minute and 24-second mark, where we see the following. Well, now we get some real insight into Paulogia's heart and why he holds the worldview that he does, and he makes the censorious, authoritarian, stupid arguments that he does. Reminder that if God doesn't exist, then neither does sin. Don't fall for guilt tactics.
Oh, ho, ho. Oh, ho, ho. Look what I've done. Look at this tweet. Wow, there's some vitriol just came out of nowhere there. So why I make the censorious and deleterious. And what else did he say? Wow, he does not like me. These are terrible things that I'm doing. I don't know where that comes from.
So, as we could see in that clip and from the very end of the previous clip, Paulogia mocks my tone of voice and mannerisms, and then acts surprised that I have such vitriol against him. Paulogia then questions why I accuse him of being censorious and authoritarian by saying that he has no idea where that comes from. By mocking my tone of voice and mannerisms in the way he did, Paulogia behaves just like all the other loser atheists I've been dealing with on the internet for years. So obviously in that regard, he's no different than the rest of them. But as for why I accuse Paulogia of being censorious and authoritarian, I will save Paulogia the work of digging through my content and just tell him the exact reasons why I accuse him of being authoritarian and censorious right here and now. I'm going to start with an old example before I transition to more modern ones. So back in 2018, Paulogia put out a video titled Atheist Banned from Ken Ham Event, Paulogia Denied. In this video, Paulogia talked about how he had booked a reservation to attend an Alberta Home Education Association conference where Ken Ham was booked as a speaker. and he had booked a reservation to attend an AIG dinner a couple of days before that. Paulogia then talks about how shortly before the AIG dinner was set to occur, the head of the Canadian branch of AIG called to inform Paul that his reservation at the AIG dinner had been canceled. And then, on the day of the actual conference by the Alberta Home Education Association, Paulogia was driving on his way to the conference when he got called and informed by the Alberta Home Education Association that his reservation at the conference had been canceled too. And then after that happened, Paulogia made a video, this video, where he portrays himself as a victim of AIG bullying before challenging Ken Ham to bring his views to the marketplace of ideas instead of canceling Paulogia from listening to Ken speak. But what Paulogia doesn't mention in his video is that back in 2017, he was interviewed by the CBC shortly after Ken Ham was booked to be a speaker at this conference by the Alberta Home Education Association. In this article, we can see Paulogia engage in cancel culture tactics by not only accusing Ken Ham of being a science denier, but also accusing the Alberta Home Education Association of not taking children's science education seriously. But don't just take my word for it. You can see on screen the article in question titled Top U.S. Creationist Invitation as Keynote Speaker for Alberta Homeschooling Convention Draws Fire. And when you go down the actual article, we see a section titled Denies Age of the Earth. And it says here, Calgarian Paul Enns says he walked away from his Christian faith after reading Ham's creationist literature and started a YouTube channel dedicated to debunking Ham's teachings. And of course, if you click on the hyperlink, it takes you to the Paulogia channel, the one that has over 100,000 subs. As a citizen of Alberta and a father, I'm very concerned that Ken Ham is being brought in on multiple levels, primarily that he is a science denier. He denies evolution. He denies the age of the earth, Enns said. He says the fact Alberta's Home Education Association has booked Ham to speak raises questions. It signals to me that this homeschool group is not serious about following provincial curriculum or proper science education for their children, he said. So when you see what Paulogia had to say in this CBC article from 2017, you begin to realize that Paulogia is not the innocent victim that he portrayed himself as. Paul wants you to believe that he was canceled by AIG and the Alberta Home Education Association unprovoked. But Paul is the one who used inflammatory language to try and get the Alberta Home Education Association to cancel their speaking engagement with Ken Ham. He did it by essentially saying to the Alberta Home Education Association, if you guys really took children's science education seriously, then you never would have booked a science denier like Ken Ham as one of your speakers at your conference. If the Alberta Home Education Association had believed what Paulogia said and canceled Ken Ham's speaking engagement, then Ken Ham would have been just another victim of cancel culture, and Paulogia would have been the cause of it. Also, if the Alberta Home Education Association would have canceled their speaking engagement with Ken Ham, I firmly believe that Paulogia would not be lamenting Ken Ham being canceled. Paul would have said something to the effect of, thank goodness that the Alberta Homeschool Education Association canceled that science denier's speaking engagement. It looks like they take children's science education seriously after all. However, in a hilarious twist, instead of the Alberta Home Education Association canceling Ken Ham's speaking engagement with them, Alberta Home Education Association instead chose to cancel Paulogia's reservation on the day of the conference right after the Canadian branch of AIG canceled Paulogia's dinner reservation with them.
Tragic irony or poetic justice? You tell me.
Now, the obvious response that Paulogia is going to have when reacting to this part of this video is that he will claim that he was not engaging in cancel culture tactics when he made those comments to the CBC in 2017. To prove that he actually was engaging in cancel culture tactics when he made those comments to the CBC in 2017, let's look at some more current examples of cancel culture in action. So I have here on screen a archived version of an article from the Telegraph titled "Free Speech Stifled as Universities Cancel Record Number of Speakers." This article came out in July of 2022. So this is 9 months old, this article. Freedom of speech is at risk of being stifled on campuses after a record number of speakers and events were rejected last year, the university's watchdog has warned. The Office for Students found that nearly 200 requests for events and speakers were rejected by English universities and colleges in 2020 through 2021, up from 94 in the previous academic year. Susan Lapworth, the Watchdog's interim chief executive, said she was concerned about the possibility that lawful views are being stifled. She warned universities that they would face regulatory intervention if they failed to meet their obligations on freedom of speech. Topics that some may find offensive or controversial must be open to free debate on campuses and across research communities, she said. The Vice-Chancellor of the University of Essex apologized last year after a seminar on trans rights and the criminal justice system was canceled following complaints that the speaker was a transphobe who was likely to engage in hate speech. So get that? There was a speaker who was going to speak on trans rights and the criminal justice system, and the University of Essex canceled the speaking engagement because there were some people who complained to the university that the speaker was a transphobe who was likely to engage in hate speech. So they threw out the inflammatory language, called the speaker a transphobe, and they went a step further and said, well, they're probably going to engage in hate speech, so we can't give them a chance. In other words, pre-crime. Well, they might commit a crime, so you should just go ahead and cancel them before they get a chance to commit the crime. The university was also criticized after Professor Rosa Friedman, an expert in international human rights law at the University of Reading, was not invited to speak at a seminar on anti-Semitism after concerns were raised about her gender-critical views. So we have two examples in just this article of speakers being canceled via cancel culture from speaking at universities because some people complained to the university that the speakers were transphobes. Here we have an article from Fire titled "Pitt Stands Firm Against Pressure to Cancel 3 Conservative Speakers Invited by Student Groups." And this article came out March 23rd, 2023, so just a few weeks ago. University of Pittsburgh students, in disregard of their peers' First Amendment rights, are pressuring administrators to cancel 3 upcoming events hosted by conservative student groups because they feature speakers the protesters consider anti-trans. Among those students' many supporters are several state lawmakers who have also publicly called on Pitt to cancel the events. Later this month, Pitt's chapter of Turning Point USA is slated to host the Daily Wire senior editor Cabot Phillips. They're also sponsoring a separate event where decorated Kentucky swimmer Riley Gaines, who tied for 5th place with transgender swimmer Leah Thomas at the NCAA championship, is expected to advocate against transgender athletes competing in women's sports. Then in mid-April, the College Republicans and Intercollegiate Studies Institute will host a debate on transgenderism and womanhood with conservative commentator Michael Knowles and Dr. Deidre McCloskey, an economist and transgender woman. The cancellation campaign began when 2 students started a petition March 7th demanding the university cancel the 3 events. It is unacceptable and against the values of this university, the petition organizers wrote, to allow groups under its administration and on its behalf to host events featuring individuals who wish to advance a platform of hate and transphobia and make our beloved institution an accomplice to the trending attacks that place trans bodies and humanity in the middle of a culture war fabricated entirely for political gain. So in other words, you have two students at the University of Pittsburgh who started a petition to cancel 3 separate conservative speakers from speaking engagements on their campus because those speakers are transphobes and they just promote hate of trans people, and therefore they shouldn't be allowed to speak and give their side of the story on this controversial issue. While these examples I have provided deal specifically with the current issue of transgenderism, I have witnessed the same tactics be used over the years to cancel speakers in relation to topics such as Islam, feminism, and creationism. Oh yeah, creationists have been the victims of cancel culture long before cancel culture was considered cool. And as proof of this, well, here's an article from 2014 in CBS Los Angeles titled, Lawsuit, CSUN Scientist Fired After Soft Tissue Found on Dinosaur Fossil. So basically what happened in 2012 is that Mark Armitage, a young earth creationist who worked as a researcher at Cal State University Northridge, he discovered soft tissue on non-fossilized Triceratops bone, and then he documented his discovery in a peer-reviewed published article. And 2 weeks after his article was published, his department head came into his office and told him, "We're not going to allow your religion on our campus," and fired Mark Armitage. But when you read Mark Armitage's paper, he doesn't mention religion, the Bible, young earth creationism, or the impact of his discovery on evolutionary dogma. Doesn't talk about any of that in the paper, and yet he was accused of doing so because the department head of his department understood the implications of Mark Armitage's discovery all too well, and so decided to can him while the going was good. This led to a lawsuit by Mark Armitage against the university, and eventually the university settled with Mark Armitage, a significant settlement, because according to Mark Armitage's lawyer, they were going to lose the unlawful discrimination lawsuit that Armitage had filed against them. So in order to avoid the embarrassment of having this exposed on the public record, they settled out with Mark Armitage with a significant sum of money. But in addition to the canceling of Mark Armitage, I have 3 giant books right here, the Slaughter of the Dissidents series, that proves with deep and thorough documentation that Christians and creationists have been canceled from the scientific and academic communities long before cancel culture was considered cool and was start to get applied to other topics. We have Slaughter of the Dissidents, Volume 1, The Shocking Truth About Killing the Careers of Darwin Doubters. We have Silencing the Darwin Skeptics, The War Against Theists, Volume 2 of the Slaughter of the Dissidents series. And then we have Censoring the Darwin Skeptics, How Belief in Evolution is Enforced by Expunging Dissidents, Volume 3 of the Slaughter of the Dissidents series. Even though Paulogia did not call for violence against Ken Ham or the Alberta Home Education Association, he definitely engaged in the same inflammatory language that cancel culturists use to get colleges, universities, and other organizations to cancel speakers that they don't like. Another example of Paulogia being a censorious authoritarian comes from his 2022 video, If I Debated Kent Hovind, Best Evidence for Evolution. And on screen you see my video response that I made to his video called Paulogia's Stipulations for Debating Kent Hovind Are Self-Contradictory and Censorious. In this video, we see Paulogia claim that biological evolution does not speak to abiogenesis, and therefore we shouldn't talk about abiogenesis in debates about evolution with creationists. This is why he made the debate stipulation of Kent Hovind, where he would grant a designer for the purpose of debate. The problem with this whole thing, though, is that when Paulogia claims that biological evolution doesn't speak to abiogenesis, he is deliberately lying to all of you. We know that Paulogia is lying not only because the Wikipedia page for abiogenesis says that abiogenesis is an evolutionary process, but because the Wikipedia page for biological evolution contains a link to the abiogenesis page in the evolutionary history of life section under the heading Origin of Life. And you don't have to take my word for it. Here on screen is the abiogenesis Wikipedia page. First paragraph says, in biology, abiogenesis, or the origin of life, is a natural process by which life has arisen from non-living matter such as simple organic compounds. The prevailing scientific hypothesis is that the transition from non-living to living entities on Earth was not a single event, but a process of increasing complexity involving the formation of a habitable planet, the prebiotic synthesis of organic molecules, molecular self-replication and self-assembly, autocatalysis, and the emergence of cell membranes. Many proposals have been made for different stages of the process. So, I just discovered something that's very interesting. The abiogenesis page here was changed to take out the word evolutionary in front of the word process that was in this first paragraph. Because if you go to the 5-minute and 2-second mark of this video, you see that I have the abiogenesis article on screen. And if you blow up my video to full page and you have my video set to 1080p resolution, you can clearly see that in the first paragraph, it says that abiogenesis is not a single event, but it is an evolutionary process. So what just happened here live and in living color is that evolutionists got tired of creationists like myself pointing out that the abiogenesis page says that abiogenesis was an evolutionary process. So sometime in the last couple of months, one of the Wikipedia moderators went into the abiogenesis article and removed the word evolutionary from in front of the word process. But they have not changed the evolution page on Wikipedia yet. As you can see here, it says for evolution, this article is about evolution in biology. So the evolution page on Wikipedia is about biological evolution. And when you go to the evolutionary history of life section and you look under origin of life subsection, there is a hyperlink to the abiogenesis article. In other words, abiogenesis is part of biological evolution. Because of what Wikipedia says on abiogenesis and biological evolution, we know for a fact that abiogenesis is part of biological evolution because biological evolution could never have occurred if abiogenesis never happened. Therefore, when Paulogia desperately tried to ban all discussion of abiogenesis from a debate with a creationist on the topic, he is not promoting an open, honest discussion on evolution. He is literally picking and choosing which parts of evolution are allowed to be discussed and which parts are not, just like the censorious authoritarian that he is. Now, it is from the 8:24 mark to the 10:32 mark of this video where we see Paulogia say the following. The reason why Paulogia makes these arguments is because he doesn't want to be held accountable for his sins.
Justin, I'd be curious, how? Tell me, Justin, how does this tweet prove that I just want to sin?
How does this tweet by Paulogia prove that he doesn't want to be held accountable for his sins?
That's what I want to know. That's what we're here for.
Well, it's really quite simple. Sin is simply a crime that you commit against God. You can either commit the crime against God directly, or you can commit it against him indirectly by committing a sin against another human being.
Thank you, Justin. That is amazing. You are the first Christian on this whole thing to properly define, at least in my old Orthodox view, what sin is. Sin is a gap between how we behave and how we think and how God wants us to behave and think. You get it. That is what sin is. Perfect. Perfect. I couldn't have said it any better myself. Well done.
But, as Paulogia points out, if God doesn't exist, then neither does... Because after all, a sin is a crime you commit against God. But if there's no God to commit a crime against, then obviously sin is fictitious. It doesn't
Yeah, so he completely agrees with the first part of my tweet. It's a simple if-then statement. If there is no God, then sin can't exist because the definition of sin is a grievance against God. That's just a simple if-then that could not be more true. It doesn't say that God doesn't exist. It said if God doesn't exist, then the concept of sin is not real. It's much like saying, this is probably a bad example, but comics are on my mind still. If there is no planet Krypton, then there is no Superman. I think that's a fair statement, right? And again, accepting the DC Comics lore, I think it's fair to say that without the planet to come from, there can be no Superman. That's a fair, true statement to make. The same as my tweet in lore, all good.
So, as we could see in that clip, Paulogia praises me and claims that I am the first Christian on YouTube to properly define what sin is. And while the praise that Paulogia gives me for my sound theology certainly feels good for my ego, I must respectfully ask Paulogia to stop praising me for my theological soundness, because if he doesn't, praise I am and standing for truth will hold up this clip of Paulogia as evidence that I've sold out to the atheists to get their attention. And in case Paulogia doesn't know what I'm talking about, I would encourage him, if he hasn't already, to watch my recent video, Praise I Am and Standing for Truth, falsely claim I sold out to atheists for attention. You'll get a real kick out of this video, Paul, if you end up watching this. Now it is from the 10:32 mark to the 11:16 mark of this video where we see the following.
Really exist. And what's the ultimate implication of all this? Well, if there is no God, and there is no crime against God to be committed, i.e. no sin, then obviously there's no creator God who's going to hold people like Paulogia accountable for the crimes that he commits against him after he's done living his life on earth.
Yeah, exactly. So again, this is all just that big if. I'm not saying there's no God. Well, the tweet isn't saying there's no God. The tweet's saying if there is no God, then the natural consequence is that sin doesn't exist. And you seem to be on board with this. So I don't know where the problem lies, and I don't know how this destroys my channel, but I'm sure we will find out.
So, after watching my clip where I say that accountability for sin doesn't exist if God and sin don't exist, Paulogia says exactly in response to that, before he questions where I am going with this. So I just want to make an important note here before we go any further that Paulogia is not denying that accountability for sin doesn't exist if God and sin don't exist. He's not denying that at all. And I just wanted to make a note of that before we continued watching the video. Now we're going to watch the next 40 seconds.
This avoidance of being held accountable for their sins by God is at the heart of most atheist attacks on God's character, especially when atheists pull out the, well, God ordered the destruction of the Canaanites and God flooded the world, committing mass genocide. The problem that these atheists face is that they really want to commit some sins against God and others.
So you, Justin, promised that you would be proving Paulogia's motives with Paulogia's own words. And now you've just gone to most atheists. Now, I don't actually necessarily disagree that this is what most non-believers would do.
So, as we see in that clip, Paulogia repeats his earlier false claim that I had promised that I was going to prove Paulogia wanted to avoid accountability for sin using only Paulogia's own words, and then Paulogia admits that my general observation I made about the atheist community, on the internet at least, is correct. As I pointed out much earlier in the video, I never promised that I would be proving my points about Paulogia using only Paulogia's own words, and that Paulogia had inserted the word only into my mouth so that he could set up his straw man to tear down later in the video. Well, we are much later in the video now, and Paulogia has returned to his straw man. It is from the 11:56 to the 12:52 mark of Paulogia's video where we see the following.
But you would need to go find words where I say, in either videos or tweets, God is a moral monster, because that is not an argument I use. In fact, I'm on record many times here and on call-in shows and lots of places that if I was shown that the God of the Bible exists, I'm actually fine with his morality. I think that the God described in the Bible has sufficient justification, sufficient authority to do whatever he wants. Now, it does mean that that God and me disagree on what is moral and what's not, but that's fine. We would just have a difference of opinion at that point, but I would need to defer to the person who had the most power. And clearly, God, the creator, has the authority and power. Me, Paulogia, does not. I don't make this argument, Justin. You are going further afield if you want to prove that me, Paulogia, just wants to sin, because it's not an argument I make.
So, as we saw in that clip, Paulogia says that he has never claimed that God is a moral monster, and he seems to think that I'm saying that he has made this argument in the past. Now, this is a case where I have made a general observation about the internet atheist community in general, and Paulogia mistook that as a charge that I am laying against him. I have never claimed that Paulogia has made this argument at any point in his time as an atheist content creator. If Paulogia had ever made such a claim, I would have made a video about it, and I would have presented that video either in the video of mine that Paulogia is responding to, or I would be presenting it right here in this video. The fact that I have never made such a video is strong evidence at this point that Paulogia has never accused God of being a moral monster. Now, it is from the 1252 mark to the 1405 mark of this video where we see the following.
People, but they know that they can't justify their sins if they acknowledge that God exists and that sin is a real thing, because then they would be forced to acknowledge that God is going to hold them accountable for how they choose to live their lives in rebellion against him. So
Okay, so this is just that weird, if I want to avoid a consequence, I just pretend that that consequence doesn't exist, is a very strange thing. So again, mentioned earlier, I was a cancer patient. I didn't like the consequences and the possible outcomes from that diagnosis. Did I then just decide that, you know what, I can avoid the consequences of my cancer by pretending that I don't have cancer? Is that a thing that a rational human does? Now, you may not think I'm a rational human, that's fine, but you can't think that all people are irrational in this way, that we know what the consequence of a thing is, but we pretend that it's not. That's not how that works. You aren't fully aware of a consequence of an action, and because I don't like it, just choose to believe something else. That's just not the way belief works. That's not the way human nature works. Again, if I'm convinced of a consequence and I truly want to avoid that consequence, I do take the action.
So, as we saw in that clip, Paulogia admits that if God and sin exist, it is incredibly silly to think you can avoid being held accountable for your sins simply by pretending that God doesn't exist. And he gives the cancer example as a way to illustrate this point. Well, guess what, Paul? I completely agree with you. It is absolutely silly and ridiculous to think that you can avoid being held accountable by God for your sins simply by pretending he doesn't exist. Paulogia got that right. What's funny, though, is that even though I agree with Paul that it is absolutely ridiculous to believe you can avoid being held accountable for your sins by God simply by pretending that God doesn't exist, this silly logic is exactly what I see the atheist internet community communicating to us by their actions every single day. So yes, Paul, I agree with you that the logic is silly, but that's what is communicated to us by your community, by your community's actions every single day. So if you want us to stop getting this idea, your community needs to change their actions. Now, it is at this point in the video where things start to get really weird, to be honest. From the 1406 mark to the 1540 mark of the video, we see Paulogia say the following.
in order to soothe their conscience, what they do is they deny that God exists, and then they deny that sin exists. And by denying that these two things exist, well then, there is no one who's going to hold them accountable for the thing.
Yeah, you got the order of operations wrong, Justin. I was not looking for a way to sin and then reverse engineered a worldview. My worldview fell apart when I did not have enough evidence that God exists, and that when there wasn't sufficient evidence to that, the natural ramification was, oh, I guess this sin concept isn't real either. And therefore, things that I was doing only because the I believed it was a sin against God, I stopped doing. Now, the thing that you would also need to show, I think, if you want to say that Paulogia specifically just wants to sin, is that I am now acting in a way that you'd think that if that was true, I would now be living this life of sin, that my life drastically changed in some way, that I shifted from Christianity and it was hampering me too much, and then I moved away to this other thing. But the boring part about me is that I'm not actually living a lifestyle that is, I think, in any way problematic with the second greatest commandment. So love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I know I don't do it perfectly, none of us do, but I generally try and live my life as loving my neighbor as myself with empathy. I try to reduce harm and increase flourishing. That is generally my goal in how I live. Obviously, I'm selfish at some points, the way everyone is, but I was that way as a Christian too, right? So that's not a lifestyle.
So, as we saw in that clip, after explaining how he rejects God's existence and doesn't honor the commands that say to honor the Lord above all else, Paulogia goes on to talk about what a good person he is because he doesn't live a hedonistic, pleasure-seeking lifestyle like a lot of unbelievers do, and because he honors to the best of his ability the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. My initial reaction to seeing Paulogia say this was to raise my eyebrows in weird shock, and I asked Paulogia on the screen, "Why are you telling me this?" I have never postulated on my channels at any point that I thought that Paulogia was living a pleasure-filled, hedonistic lifestyle, so I initially had no idea why Paulogia was telling me this. However, as I will discuss in a bit, I got an idea of why Paulogia is bearing his soul to a little nobody like me. Now it is from the 15:40 mark to the 16-minute 14-second mark of the video, where we see Paulogia get a little cringy.
Shift. I am blessed in the weird non-religious way. I am a cis male, and so I am very lucky that Christianity just accepts who I am, my identity. I don't have to be put in the place where my identity is in conflict with what the Bible says. That's just fortunate for me and unfortunate for many others. For me, it's harder to point to say that, my identity as a cis man is in conflict with the Bible, and that's why I rejected it. No, you can't even point to that for me, and as terrible as that all is. So just, wow, if you're going to try and prove the Paulogia.
So, as we saw in that clip, Paulogia repeatedly identifies himself as a cisgender male multiple times in a span of 34 seconds. I don't know what else to say, Paul, but by identifying yourself as a cisgender male, I'm afraid I have no choice but to report you to the MCA. You're going to have to stay in town while they conduct their investigation into you, so don't go anywhere. Also, don't be surprised if your membership card gets revoked. What? Who is the MCA? Why, they are the Man Card Association, of course.
Your membership to the Continental has been by thine own hand revoked.
Hey, something burning? Oh, wait, it's you, because you just got burnt.
Now, it is from the 16:14 mark to the 16-minute 53-second mark of the video where we see the following.
Oh, just, wow, if you're going to try and prove the Paulogia does this, show me where I'm sinning. Now, obviously, there are a few things in my life that, I would need to have a quick wedding ceremony. That would be fine. There's a few tiny changes I would need to make to get in line with Christian values. The main thing that I don't do right now is the first part of that commandment. Love the Lord your God with your heart, all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And the second part, love your neighbor yourself. I think I'm doing as good as a human can do on that second part. Not perfect, but that's what I try to do. It is that first part that I would need to radically change. But that is the part that fell away. And that is the part that would instantly come back if I became convinced that God existed. So
as we saw in that clip, Paulogia continues to claim that he's a good person who tries to the best of his ability to follow the commandment to honor his neighbor as himself. And Paulogia says that if someone could prove to him that God existed, he would fall in line and keep all the commands having to do with honoring the Lord in addition to keeping the other commands. Now, disregarding his self-identification as a cisgender male, When I think about what Paulogia said over the previous 3 minutes of his video, he basically said that even though he doesn't believe that God exists, and even though he doesn't always follow God's commands, especially the ones about honoring the Lord above all else, he touted himself as a good person who obeys the commands that have to do with loving your neighbor as himself. He claims that he doesn't live a hedonistic lifestyle, and he claims that if it could just be proven to him that God exists, he would fall in line and obey those commands that deal with honoring the Lord above all else. As I was watching Paulogia lay all this out, I got the visual of a criminal sitting in a courtroom before a judge who was about to convict him of violating a court order. And across from this criminal is the prosecutor. Just imagine this criminal taking the witness stand and saying to the prosecutor, "I know that I have violated a court order to cease having contact with the victim, but I don't believe that the judge who issued the order exists, so that court order doesn't exist either. I know that I have violated the court order that says I have to comply with all the judge's orders, but I kept all the other court orders in relation to my case, and I'm a good person in general who loves his neighbor as himself. If you could successfully convince me that the judge exists, then I would fall in line and follow the court order that says I have to follow the judge's orders as well." Now, would the judge accept the line of reasoning by the criminal? No, the criminal would be found in contempt of court by the judge, and that criminal would be off to prison by then. Now, Paulogia would rightly recognize in this hypothetical example that the line of reasoning used by the criminal is a weak, pathetic attempt to avoid being held accountable for the crimes that they have committed, and yet this is the exact same line of reasoning that Paulogia himself uses to justify himself before God. And this is where things got interesting as I thought about what he was saying. Even though I am the one that Paulogia is speaking to in this video, it became obvious to me that Paulogia is not trying to justify himself to me with this 3-minute monologue he went on. Paulogia is really trying to justify himself before God, and since I happen to be the closest representative of God to him at that moment by virtue of my video being on his computer screen, Paulogia chose me to be the one to lay this all out on. Now, it is from the 16-minute 53-second mark to the 18-minute 6-second mark of the video where we see Paulogia say the following.
That's the big thing I wanted to do. I didn't want to believe God exists. I didn't want to love him anymore, so I'm denying his existence. Does that make any sense? Is that the just want to sin that you think? That is so circular, it makes me dizzy. That's a long enough rant. Let's continue.
Things that they do and the way that they choose to live their life. This is how atheists can justify being double-minded hypocrites who have major double standards. This is why atheists and evolutionists can condemn Christians and creationists for the very same things that evolutionists themselves do.
I don't know exactly what grapes he has with me. Clearly, he's got a list of grapes with me, and maybe I need to go back dig in his library to see what he thinks that I've been doing. Generally, though, when someone like myself comment on Christian behavior, it is not because of double standard. It is generally because of internal critique. We are saying, if Christianity is true, and you believe Christianity is true, then to be consistent with Christianity, should a Christian not act in a certain way? That's typically the critique. If and when I critique Christian behavior at all, which is rare. It's not. It is merely internal. It's not a double standard, unless you can show me otherwise. I'd love to see this evidence in my own words.
So in that clip, Paulogia claims that he does not have hypocritical double standards when it comes to judging Christians and creationists. Paulogia is lying when he says this. As I already showed earlier in the video, Paulogia is a total hypocrite when it comes to cancel culture tactics because he used cancel culture tactics against Can-Ham in 2017 before complaining about AIG using cancel culture tactics on him in 2018. But let me provide one more example of Paulogia using hypocritical double standards. And for this double standard, we have to return to Paulogia's video that he did, the video that's titled, "If I Debated Kent Hovind, Best Evidence for Evolution." Now, in this video, Paulogia said that Kent Hovind would be allowed to use science textbooks to define evolution for the debate, But then, later on in the video, Paulogia said that Kant was not allowed to use the evidence for evolution that is provided by those same textbooks in their debate. Paulogia is essentially saying that the definitions of evolution provided by the textbooks are valid enough to be used in a debate, but the evidences for evolution provided by those textbooks are not valid enough to be used in a debate. Well, here's the thing. If the definitions of evolution provided by those textbooks are valid enough to be used in a debate, then the evidence for those definitions of evolution provided by those same textbooks should be valid enough to be used in a debate. But if the evidences for evolution provided by those textbooks are not valid enough to be used in a debate, then the definitions of evolution provided by those textbooks should not be used in a debate either. Either use the textbooks in their entirety or don't use them at all. You don't get to pick and choose which parts of the textbooks can or cannot be used in a debate, because that is self-serving and it is too easy to manipulate a debate into your favor by controlling what's allowed to be talked about. This whole thing is a huge double standard by Paulogia that is intended to rig a potential future debate with Kanthoven in his favor. And if he used this standard against any creationist, it would be rigging the debate potentially in Paulogia's favor. Now, it is from the 1806 to the 1958 mark of this video where we see Paulogia say the following.
Otherwise, let's get to my words, see what I do.
As a matter of fact, it is so bad that atheists and evolutionists will tell you that even if you can prove that the biblical worldview is true and that the atheistic evolutionary worldview is false, they still won't accept the biblical worldview, and they will still reject the God of the Bible.
I do not profess that. I am on record multiple times. I know some of my fellow content creators are so bold as to say that the God of the Bible is such a monster that even if he was true, I was going to spit in his eye on Judgment Day and say, "You're a moral monster." I am not that person. I am pragmatic. If I come to believe that the God of the Bible is true, as I mentioned earlier, I do think that someone with that kind of level of authority can just do what they want and therefore does make the rules, and I would accept their rules under that proper authority. I'm not going to be that person. It may be a character flaw in me. You may disagree with me on this, but no, if I come to believe the God of the Bible exists, I'm not going to spit in his eye and call him a moral monster. I'm going to step in line. So unless you got video of me saying otherwise, you are not talking about me, even though it's my name in the video.
If you don't believe me, well, let me give you just one example of this, even though I could give you more than one.
Okay, so perfect. My own words, he's got examples. I just asked for examples. Boom, I'm going to get called out here. Rats, what have I done?
I have here a video from Germania titled, "Why I Don't Argue Against Classical Theism or Creationism, Atheist." So
That's not my video. That's not my words. It's not an argument. So your many examples of how Paulogia just wants this in is some video from a person I've never heard of. Really?
So, as we saw in that clip, Paulogia says that he does not agree with his fellow atheists when they say that they would still reject the God of the Bible even if it was proven to them that he existed, and Paulogia seems to think that I believe he agrees with his fellow atheists on this because I put his name in the title of my video. Paulogia then claims that I'm showing clips of someone else making the claim when I was allegedly going to prove that Paulogia was making the claim. As I have already explained at the beginning of this video, just because I have Paulogia's name in the title of my video does not mean that I'm not going to talk about things I've observed in the general atheist community that Paulogia may or may not be guilty of. Paulogia is the one who created a straw man of my argument in the beginning by falsely claiming that I said that I was going to use only Paulogia's words in this video. Don't worry, Paul. If you've made it this far into this video, you can see that this video is almost entirely about you, just like you wanted. Now, Paulogia, to my knowledge, has never claimed that he would reject the God of the Bible, even if it could be proven to Paul that he existed. However, Paulogia rubs elbows with and is part of the same internet atheist community full of atheist content creators who do make those claims. If Paulogia continues to stick around those people, then there is still time for him to potentially come around to their position, which is that God is a moral monster, and even if he could be proven to be true, I would still reject him. there's still time for Paulogia to come around to that position, especially if he keeps hanging around the people who do hold to that position. Now, as from the 1958 mark to the 2033 mark of the video, where we see Paulogia say the following.
So, when you see evolutionists and atheists like Paulogia tell you that they reject the biblical worldview because there's no good evidence supporting its truthfulness or God's existence, or they tell you that evolution and atheism is true because there's all this good evidence supporting it.
It's hilarious that you're, again, lumping evolutionists and atheists together because, once again, hundreds of millions of Christians accept evolution based on the evidence, and they clearly are not doing it because they want to reject God because they accept God. So try again.
So, as we see in that clip, Paulogia returns to the argument that theistic evolutionists believe in evolution in billions of years, despite the fact that they allegedly accept God. As I have already explained earlier in the video, old Earth creationists and theistic evolutionists are heretics and false teachers who not only put the majority opinion of the scientific and academic community on a higher level of authority than the Bible on the issue of origins, but they also admit that they reinterpret the Bible to make it fit their beliefs, even though they know they're not supposed to do that. So, nice try, Paul, but I'm not a gullible fool like most of your audience. I am way ahead of you on the issue of old Earth creationism, and that's because over the years I've made just as many or more videos dealing with the issue of old Earth creationism than I have atheistic evolution. I also used to be an old Earth creationist until right before I started my career as a content creator, so I have a unique insight into old Earth creationism compared to most young Earth creationists that you'll talk to on planet Earth. Now, it is from the 2033 mark to the 2127 mark of Paulogia's video where we see the following.
That is all a crock. That is a pack of lies. That is just an intellectual smokescreen. The real
Crock, I say. Pack of lies. Intellectual smokescreen.
reason why people like Paulogia reject the biblical worldview, and the real reason why people like Paulogia accept atheism, evolution, and deep time is because they're trying to avoid being held accountable for their sins.
So you haven't proven that with my own words, as you promised, at all. You've made a conjecture based on a tweet, which you actually agree with the content of the tweet. You just think somehow you know my heart and why I tweeted it, which is just bizarre. You haven't shown that I am currently living a lifestyle of sin other than that I do reject God. So that sin I hold and will change if I come to believe in him. You're not using my own words. You're not proving anything other than your own ideas.
So, as we see in that clip, Paulogia claims that it is bizarre that I think I know Paulogia's heart. Paulogia then says that I have not proven that he is living a hedonistic lifestyle before Paulogia admits that he has sinned against God by denying his existence. I have never once claimed in any of my videos that Paulogia himself lives a hedonistic lifestyle, so I have zero idea why Paulogia thinks that I have. Then again, this could be just another straw man that Paulogia is making of me in order to make himself look like the winner in this back and forth discussion. But since Paulogia brought up his heart, let's talk briefly about our hearts. If Paulogia knows the scriptures as well as he portrays himself to in his content, then he knows full well that the Bible teaches that the human heart is deceitful and beyond cure, Jeremiah 17:9. He also knows that Jesus taught that thinking about sinning is itself sin. For example, Jesus taught that merely lusting after a woman in your heart is the same as committing adultery with her, Matthew 5:27-28. I know I'm guilty of violating that teaching, and I can guarantee that Paulogia violated that teaching as well, especially when you know his girlfriend Shannon Q, the atheist content creator who bragged a couple years ago about starting a new religion that's based on sexual pleasure. Yeah, even if Paulogia has never lived a hedonistic lifestyle, even if he's lived an ethically good life, he knows full well that God condemns him as a sinner just based on his thoughts. Paulogia knows that he has thought about sinning in the ways that Bible describes as sin, and he knows that that alone is enough to condemn him. Because the God of the Bible doesn't demand perfection with just your words that you speak verbally and your actions and your behavior. He also demands perfection internally. He demands perfection with your thoughts. And by that standard, we all fail. Now, it is over the next 19 seconds that we see the following.
So we know in reality that even if they delude themselves into thinking that God doesn't exist.
Right. And the other thing, the stupidest thing I could possibly do, and maybe you think that I am just the stupidest human on earth, that maybe that's true. But the stupidest thing I could do is know that I'm going to be held accountable for my sins and just pretend that I'm not.
So, as we saw in that 19-second clip, Paulogia admits that he would have to be pretty stupid to know that he's going to be held accountable for his sins, and then pretend that he's not going to be held accountable for his sins by pretending that God and sin don't exist. I agree with you, Paul, that is pretty stupid, but the problem with you claiming this is the things you've already said and admitted to in this video. You've already denied that God exists. You've already acknowledged that sin doesn't exist because you don't believe that God exists. When I pointed out that accountability for sin doesn't exist if God and sin don't exist, you said yeah in response, so obviously you currently believe that you're not going to be held accountable for your sins or the way that you chose to live your life when you die. You claimed earlier in the video that we current humans are all apes, which is an argument that someone trying to avoid accountability for their sins would make. And we also see you spend close to 3 minutes attempting to justify yourself by talking about what a good person you are in spite of your rejection of God, which is exactly the kind of behavior I would expect to see from someone who is attempting to make a case to God for the purpose of avoiding accountability for sin. So by Paul's own admissions throughout this video, he is doing the very things one does in the most pathetic attempt in history to avoid accountability for his sins. I'm sorry, Paul, but you're doing the things that one does when they're trying to avoid accountability for sin, including the part where you claim that we're all apes and you tried to justify what a good person you were in spite of your rejection of God. Those are things a person does when they're trying to avoid accountability for sin, and you might not like hearing that, but that's the way it is, and that's what the fruit of your actions is. Now we are going to look at the final clip of this video, which goes from the 21-minute 46-second mark to the 22-minute 22-second mark, where we see the following.
It doesn't take much thought and brain that if I am convinced that I'm going to be held accountable for my sin, that I just accept Jesus and keep on sinning. Now, probably, again, if I'm a true believer of Jesus, I'm going to want to sin less. That's typically the argument and whatever, and that's fine. That'd be great. But it's the Christians who have consequence-free ways of sinning. The correct strategy to avoid the consequences of sin is to become a Christian. No two ways about it. And so if I become convinced that sin is real and that God is real, that is what I will do. At least the God of the Bible, that is what I will do.
That's the biggest load of bull I've ever heard.
So, as we saw in that final clip, Paulogia claims that if you want to avoid accountability for your sins, then becoming a Bible-believing Christian is the better option than atheistic evolution. I seriously hope that Paulogia is just trolling me for giggles when he made this claim, because if he did, then he and I can have a laugh together and move on with our lives. But if Paulogia is being serious when he makes this claim, then all I have to say to Paul is that you are a big fat liar and you know that you're lying. All one has to do to figure out that Paulogia is a lying sack of crap when he claims that biblical Christianity is a better option than atheistic evolution for avoiding accountability for sin is to simply compare the biblical worldview to the atheistic evolutionary worldview that Paulogia holds to. Now, in the biblical worldview, God exists, sin exists, and accountability for sin exists. Not only is most of the world going to the lake of fire, but most people who call themselves Christians are going there too, according to Jesus. Furthermore, the God of the Bible is present everywhere on earth and in the universe, and he can see into the deepest, darkest parts of our minds and hearts. He knows everything we think, he sees everything we do, he sees everywhere we go, and he knows our every desire. Because of this, God knows when someone genuinely submits to him, and he knows when someone is only pretending to submit to him in order to avoid accountability for their sins. Now, Paulogia could argue that people who repent of their sins, accept the gospel, and submit to Jesus avoid accountability for their sins when they do so. Well, even if we just accept Paulogia's claim at face value, the biblical worldview still has most of the people of the world being held accountable for their sins, which includes every disingenuous person who views the faith as a get-out-of-jail-free card to avoid accountability for their past, present, and future sins. Even if there was a way to avoid accountability for sin in the biblical worldview without having genuine faith, there is way too much work involved to make it a feasible option. In the atheistic evolutionary worldview, however, there is no God, there is no sin, and there is therefore no accountability for sin. There is also no objective moral standard outside of the individual or collective human mind to judge actions, behaviors, and thoughts as objectively right or wrong. You can literally do whatever you desire as long as you can get away with it before you die, because we're all just apes anyway. It is way easier to avoid accountability for sin by accepting the atheistic evolutionary worldview, because all you have to do is believe in the atheistic evolutionary worldview. You don't have to change your heart's desires or your behavior in order to avoid accountability for sin in the atheistic evolutionary worldview. You're automatically exempt from any accountability for fictitious crimes committed against a fictitious God from the beginning. So if I want to avoid accountability for my sins, and I have to choose between the biblical worldview and the atheistic evolutionary worldview, I will go with the atheistic evolutionary worldview every single time. It is the path of least resistance, and it requires far less work than the biblical worldview in order to avoid accountability for sin. So now we are at the conclusion of the video, or as some people like to call it, the heart of the matter. And what I have to say here in conclusion, after watching all of this, after responding to all of Paulogia's claims and arguments, this is what I concluded. After watching this video Paulogia made in response to me and going through everything in it, I have concluded that Paulogia is a confused man who is at war, to some extent, with himself, internally. On the one hand, we have seen that Paulogia is a censorious authoritarian who practices hypocritical double standards. We have also seen Paulogia lie about my arguments by creating a straw man version of them to knock them down throughout his video. Paul has also denied God's existence to such an extent that he claims that we are all apes instead of human beings made in the image of God. Paulogia has a lot he has to answer to God for. But on the other hand, we have also seen Paulogia try to justify himself by talking about what a good person he is and how he would fall right back in line with the biblical worldview if it could be proven that God exists. It's almost like Paulogia is pleading to God to prove that he exists because a part of Paulogia wants to believe in the biblical worldview, wants to believe in Jesus and the gospel, wants to be a good Bible-believing Christian. Otherwise, Paulogia would not have admitted to trying to follow the commands of the biblical worldview that have nothing to do with honoring the Lord above all else. A man who has fully cut himself off from his past faith does not try to justify himself like that. As far as I can tell, based on my current knowledge base and my past experiences, I'd say there is a 50-50 chance that Paulogia stays an atheist his whole life versus Paulogia becoming a Christian again. Part of Paulogia's heart is very hard against the Lord, but there is still a part of Paul's heart that is soft for the Lord. If you are a Christian hearing this, you should be praying that the soft part of Paulogia's heart overtakes the rest of his heart. If you're an atheist or evolutionist watching this, you should be scared spitless by what you're hearing, and you should be tempted to pray that the hard part of Paulogia's heart squashes out the soft part. As far as I can tell, Paulogia is smarter than most, if not all of you. He's the most articulate of you, and he understands philosophy and the Bible better than most of you. Paulogia is probably the most effective atheist apologist on the internet, and yet there is a chance that he could swing back to the Lord later on in his life. Even though I have to bring this video response to Paulogia to a close, the war for people's souls rages on, and until the Lord returns, it's not over yet.
But the war goes on. Nothing is over!